Good evening, everyone. Hope your week is going well. It has definitely been a lot in terms of snow and everything else, and really cold temperatures, to which I don't think anybody likes or enjoys, if I were to be completely honest with you. And the people that say they love the cold, then go stand outside and enjoy the cold. But they never do. I don't get it. At least whenever I say I love the warm weather, I love being outside at least. But it's not like I love the warm weather, but I'm going to stay inside the air conditioning. No, I enjoy being out, but I digress. Anyways, this evening, as we continue into the book of Daniel, we find our place in Daniel chapter 1. We're going to be looking at verses 8 through 10 this evening. And as we begin, just a little bit of recap. There's been a lot of information that we've looked at over the last few weeks, not only into the background of Daniel, but especially into verses 1 through 7, and just kind of the name changes, the designations behind some of the names, even as it relates to Babylonian gods. There again, just the assimilation of life that goes into what exactly the Hebrew boys begin to experience and everything. And so tonight we kind of jump off into, I would say, the first real level of wait a minute, what's going on kind of part of the book of Daniel, at least into chapter 1, as we are thinking about their entry into the kingdom of Babylon. And so this evening, as we kick off, Daniel chapter 1 there, verse 8, it begins by saying, Daniel determined that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine he drank. So he asked permission from the chief official not to defile himself. We then go into verse 9. He says, and God had granted Daniel favor and compassion from the chief official. And then he says, yet he said to Daniel, my lord, the king assigned your food and drink, and I'm afraid of what would happen if he saw your faces looking thinner than those of the younger men your age. You would endanger my life with the king. So going back to this idea in verse 8 of Daniel is seeing, as it comes later on, the writing on the wall, but he is seeing some of the characteristics of what exactly the Babylonians do, kind of their way of life, their culture, their mentality, those do's and don'ts, if you would, that he begins to kind of look around and he's evaluating and he's seeing, okay, there's a climax that's coming. There's a place to where, as Daniel, I'm sure, is looking within and saying, okay, where do these things stand? What about my relationship with God? He sees that there's going to be a butting of heads, so to speak, as things begin to move forward. And so for him to look and say, Daniel, in verse 8 here, determined that he would not defile himself with the king's food or the wine he drank. Let's stop and think about that for a moment. Why would Daniel say something or be inclined to act or behave in this kind of way? Let's think about it here. Okay, so the Mosaic law required diet laws in a foreign land. So typically, of course, the book of Leviticus outlines this, and several other places you find kind of these understandings that whenever you're in foreign lands, it's not that you just throw things by the wayside, to which I would say that's why I've got in parentheses there, not while in Rome. See, the typical understanding is, while in Rome, or if the Romans do, so do we, this kind of, if everybody else is doing it, I'll do it too kind of thing. That's not biblical. That's not the model to which we're in. There again, are our convictions, are they preceded by what is going on around us, potentially traditions? What we think is convictional even within the church. I would say that there's still a stark contrast, even in the midst of those things, to where we think of what is conviction for right here versus what may be conviction somewhere else. What is convictional for us is not convictional for those in Africa. There again, thinking about even mission trips that I've been on and stories that I'm familiar with. Whenever you enter into certain homes outside of America, I don't want to say it's required, but it is extremely customary, that the man enters first, not the husband, as he kind of, we see it more of an act of, I don't want to say chivalry, but we see it more as an act of humility. It's I love you going forward, but in other cultures, they don't practice those things the same way. So there again, even for us, convictional lines look different in and amongst other customs in other cultures. Hence, even for Daniel, he's seeing these things and he's experiencing these things, but it doesn't necessarily mean that he ought to do them. So there are customary cultural things that we are under conviction about, and then there are, I believe, deeper rooted biblical convictions to which we adhere to, that go or even cross the lines of saying, like, it has nothing to do with culture, this is just what I am. If you go to Italy and everybody there is drinking and everything else, maybe you don't drink here in the U.S., but you're like, well, I'm on vacation, or I'm here, and there everybody else is doing it. Like there's certain criteria to which I would say that's part of what Daniel is coming from, is he is saying there's things that I typically wouldn't do, and then there's biblically things that are just out of the question. And so thinking about this, that's where the Mosaic law begins to come in, because he says in verse 8, he was not going to partake of the food or with the wine he drank. So the king's food, just to kind of give you an idea, you have pork and horse flesh were common food to the Babylonians. Okay, so of course, obviously, in the Old Testament, we know that as it pertains to pork or, that of pigs, it's undefiled. It is something that is, or it is defiled. It's something that they could not touch. And then, of course, Daniel comes in and he's seeing it in abundance around him. They're doing things that he is not supposed to do. So there again, you're talking customary things versus what is biblically rooted, and it is a deep convictional way to which Daniel is operating. So naturally, this begins to kind of say, the food may have been offered to Marduk or even other gods that the Babylonians worshipped. So there again, for Daniel, he's looking and he's saying, this food is, I don't want to say blessed, but they have received it from another source, another origin, somebody that is not Yahweh, somebody that is in fact a false or a fake god. So for Daniel to acknowledge these things in the world in which he's living, there again, think about this. He's been deported, he's officially a captive, he's also now being tried and tested to be able to function within, the king's courtyard, or, the courts and everything else, as we've learned about in verses 1 through 7 there. So you've got this mound of buildup behind Daniel that the window or the ability to operate is extremely small and narrow as it pertains to what his request, what he can do. It's very limited on that side of it. And so here it is, he's looking at these things, I can't eat these things, but furthermore, they're potentially offered or from, blessed, so to speak, from other gods. And he's saying, okay, that time out, we have to do something about this. So to partake of these things, of course, as you see there on the screen there, would have been a voluntary worship of their gods. According to some scholars, that's what they've said, is that for Daniel to have taken it, in essence, he would have been acknowledging or saying, I worship potentially the same gods that you do. So to that, I would say it's the same argument of 1 Corinthians chapter 8, whenever Paul was talking about meat that is sacrificed to idols. He says, and he lays out the case, the argument, the premise, the scope of the whole 9 yards of, okay, it's meat. Meat is meat. Like, okay, we've moved on past that. Peter dealt with that back in Acts 11. Like, we've seen this kind of transition between the Mosaic law into the New Testament. That is the new covenant under Christ. That's what ultimately is running through Paul's mind, but at least into the Corinthian church, and of course the craziness that ensued, who they were as a congregation and as a community of believers. I mean, it was wild in a lot of ways, but nevertheless, what did he make the statement of there in chapter 8? That if eating meat that is sacrificed to idols causes my brother to stumble, I will not do it. Paul, in essence, was saying there's nothing wrong with the meat. We know who it belongs to, who it goes to. It's not from, I don't care if it's Marduk or if it's Baal or Ashtaroth or whoever. Like, that's irrelevant in Paul's mind. But he says, if it's going to cause my brother to stumble or cause him to look in a way that says, is that really God-fearing? Is that the way that we should be doing? He said, their salvation, in essence, this is what he's drawing out, their salvation holds no candlestick to anything else. Their salvation is the most important thing. And if it means me giving up meat in order for them to be saved, he's saying, I'm going to do that. And so here you have Daniel who's looking at this and he's saying, I can't do it. There's restrictions. There are things within this that, of course, difference of the New Testament and the Old Testament, but at least at this moment, Christ hasn't died on the cross. He's looking at it and he's saying, there's but one way. There is only one way to appease God right now, or to be found in favor with Him, and that is to literally surrender to what He had in the moment, which was the Mosaic Law and the traditions of Israel at that time. But in verse 9, God granted Daniel favor and compassion from the chief officials. So in this verse, think about this. God brought favor. We've talked a little bit about this on Sunday in Galatians 1 there a couple of weeks ago. But overall, God brought favor, this grace that is found into it. And it literally means compassion and tender feeling. And of course, we're talking about there in verse 3, I believe it is, about Ashpenaz as the chief eunuch that is found in the midst of them there. But either way, they begin to have this conversation, and God grants favor with the chief eunuch, hence this idea of compassion, tender feeling. There's a bond, there's a relationship. Then I would suggest, a short amount of time to which that has been built, and now Ashpenaz is looking at it like, wait a minute, okay, like, we're doing really good. We're friends in a roundabout way. But, okay, hold on a second. But stop and notice the respect that has been forged. Stop and consider the level of what is happening and going on right here. I mean, you're seeing, of course, this convictional data out of Daniel's life that is saying, I worship Yahweh, y'all don't. I have this standard to follow, and you all don't, so to speak. And because of that, I'm under obligation. My hands are tied, literally. Like, Ashpenaz, I don't know what you expect me to do about this. Like, this is much deeper than what you realize. But yet, we begin to learn in verse 10. He says, Yet he said to Daniel, My lord the king assigned your food and drink. I'm afraid of what would happen if he saw your faces, looking thinner than those of the other young men your age. You would endanger my life with the king. I mean, consider the juxtaposition here of what Daniel is asking, how he is feeling about what potentially, Nebuchadnezzar is going to say, and he's rolling kind of the footage in his mind of his life saying, this has got danger written all over it. There's some significant things to consider, from his standpoint. And so in verse 10 there, clearly, if Daniel and his friends were unhealthy, they were not valuable, but the king would have wondered why. So ultimately, it would have fell back to the chief of the eunuchs to figure out what was happening and going on. What took place? Why are these unhealthy and those are fine? There becomes this dichotomy between it all to where there's some real risk that is coming into play right now as to where Daniel stands and what they are ultimately requesting, beginning to think through, and how they are processing this moment. So consider what Ashpenaz was looking at. Consider that ultimate question. What does it mean to defy the leaders? Because that's in essence what Daniel is saying, like, we can't do this. I don't care if the king has said this. Yahweh is better. Yahweh is greater. Yahweh is stronger. I'm under obligation, so to speak, to listen to Yahweh definitely a whole lot more than Nebuchadnezzar. Consider, that point of defying the leadership of the Babylonians. I mean, you're seeing early on, and that's why a lot of people love the book of Daniel, is because you see this kind of butting of heads of real life understanding and acknowledgement of, government has one thing, but God has another. We are, as Scripture says, you can't serve God and mammon, but yet we have to pick and choose on to which hill we're going to die with. And I would hope that we would be saying, God, I'd rather die with you any day than with the world for even a split second. So, in a point of application, I want you to consider this, okay? Naturally, I think that this is a big thing that's going on right now within our country, and of course I want to make these things relevant, but are Christians bound to pay taxes to a government that supports unbiblical things? So here is kind of what I'm thinking of, okay? As citizens of our country, we pay taxes. Several years ago, thankfully a lot of it is dying off, at least for the moment, we were paying taxes that funded abortion. Now, did that mean I supported abortion? No. But did it mean that I had a small hand in what was potentially going on? I think that there's a level of complicity that goes into it. And there again, I'm sharing with you my convictional lines, okay? Now, did I stop paying my taxes? No, that's not what I'm saying, okay? But the reality is, I had, and still do in other ways, deep convictional processes and problems about where my tax money is going because I know that it ain't godly in the end, okay? And hence I've got the scripture there and the reference, okay? Render to Caesar what is Caesar's. That is ultimately, what Jesus told the disciples. Render to Caesar what is Caesar's, render to God the things of God, okay? So there is, there's always going to be this imbalance that is overshadowing our world. But even in Romans 13, it encourages us. Paul told the church of Rome, submit to the leadership of the government. But there is still always going to be this butting of heads. Does that mean we're always going to get our way? No, we're not. It's not that Christians are just going to always be right or standing on the right side of things. It doesn't mean like anything else within our world because it is fallen that there is not this constant evolution of looking and saying, we've got to find a point of compromise. You can't have it this way, I can't have it this way. We've got to find a way to meet in the middle. We've got to find a way to keep dialogue open and conversations open, considering the things that are going on. Do I appreciate right now that there are all kinds of things coming out within our government at the moment that has been declared fraud and this and that and people pocketing things? And yeah, I'm not in favor of that. Never have been, never will be. Their corruption, sadly enough, is always going to be a real thing. And until we, the people, as is stated within the preamble of our Constitution, are able to look and say, hey, we have a voice. It is a democracy. It's not a dictatorship. It's not this or that. But it is we, the people, that have to decide. That's where my heart kicks in of saying, we, the people, who cares about the presidency, so to speak, or Republican or Democrat or independent or this or that? All of those things don't mean a hill of beans in the end result of things. What matters is where's God in the middle of it. Now, am I going to say that God has told me to stop paying my taxes? No, I'm not going to say that. Even though I disagree, even though I don't, function in that kind of reality, there are certain things that are just always going to be in the functionality and the ways of this world. But I do believe there's a fine line between whenever the government begins to say, this is not of God and we're forcing you to do it, and we begin to raise our hands and say, I ain't gonna. I'm under obligation. I am a servant of God, not of the country I live in. While I'm patriotic and I love, and we are blessed as a nation. There again, don't misconstrue or misunderstand what I'm saying. I am under more of a precedent to follow God than I am our country. I'd rather follow the one who is holy and perfect rather than those who are unholy, potentially scheming and scamming and frauding and this and that. I'm going to go with the one who's holy and righteous and Yahweh every single time. No question about it. But there comes a place to where I do believe within Scripture it affirms that a voice has to be heard. And I think that that's what makes this so integral for Daniel and the friends to consider is that They are making a stand. They are allowing their voice to be heard. Are they doing it in a combative way? No. There again, Ashpenaz and Daniel, they have I would say, a decent relationship for what it is. But does it mean that it's Daniel saying, well, if you don't do this, man, I'm going to kill you in your sleep? No. There's no violence. It's a conversation. And to me, that is where our culture today is. Well, I digress. But anyways, here's the ultimate question that is in my mind. Does our faith stand out in an unbiblical worldview and or culture? Because typically, here's what happens far too often. We are not people of drama. Well, some of us are, but some of us ain't. But whenever people come up and they try to shove and enforce their ideologies and their beliefs or their political views or this or that down our throat, oftentimes as Christians, we are far more off to say, okay, you believe what you want, I'm going to believe what I want, and just leave me alone. Like there's a dialogue of, okay, you're crazy and I'm not, or, whatever, so let's just let bygones be bygones and, just kind of go our separate ways. There is a level to of where we become complicit to an extent of not standing up for God's views, God's humanity, the very essence of who God is and His core values. There comes a level, I think, to where we become complicit in actually going against it rather than going for it because we don't stand up to share, thus saith the Lord. I think back to times in the Scripture to where Jesus said, if you deny me before God, I'll deny, or, before man, I'll deny you before my Father who's in heaven. I think back to those moments to where even in my own life, I had a gentleman I worked with several years ago, and he was pretty out there in his beliefs in God, but if there was anything, I had multiple conversations with him. And it was one of those things that, I didn't really know as much as I did then as what I do now, but at the time I felt like I was doing all that I could. But I believe God rewarded that. I believe God blessed me because I was at least standing up and saying, no, that ain't right. This ain't good. So I would just encourage us to evaluate. What does it mean whenever we hear a coworker say, there's no God, or, all the abortion talk or funding discussions or, the fraud that's going on, ICE agents and immigration. There's all kinds of things that are flooding, so to speak, the ideologies of our country, and there is becoming and growing a deeper divide within our areas. But as Christians, I do still believe we have to be able to look and say, persecution is the result of God-fearing people following in the ways of God. Because persecution is going to come if Christians are doing their job. So can I ask, in a world of which there's so much chaos right now, or within a country, is there a lot of persecution right now? Maybe there ought to be, because as people, we're standing up like Daniel and his friends and saying, wait a minute, you have your right to go this way, but I've got to look at it from a different angle. Maybe this challenges you. Maybe it gives you a point to think about, or maybe there's an individuality in your mind that you're like, yeah, I need to do that with this person. Can I encourage you? You're going to stand before God one day, and you're going to give account for the life to which you lived. And I would hope and pray that it is a life that has been standing out and saying, God, you captured my heart, you had my undivided attention, and I did my best to make you known in the world. Daniel wanted to make God known. We'll see the rest of it, I guess, next week. But either way, I hope that this has encouraged you in some way to stand up and stand out for your faith. But I love y'all. I hope y'all have a great and wonderful rest of your week. If you need anything, please let me know. If you have any questions, let me know. Definitely stay warm. It's a tad bit chilly out there right now. But apart from that, I guess we'll see y'all later. Bye, guys.